Maya Williams did not believe in fate, but if she had, she would have said it was raining the night her silence finally met its match. The office tower she stood in was pristine, all glass and chrome and whisper-quiet elevators that never creaked, a place where everything and everyone moved with curated purpose. At 32, Maya had been a widow for nearly 2 years and a CEO for almost 5. Her life was compartmentalized into calendars and budgets and boardroom diplomacy, all conducted with the polished grace of someone who had learned long ago that vulnerability had no place in high-rise boardrooms or five-star client dinners. Her late husband, Elijah, had once told her she carried stillness like armor, and maybe he was right. But armor rusts, especially when worn too long. That night, she stayed later than usual, not to finish a proposal, but to breathe. She needed quiet, the kind that didn't judge or push, the kind that felt like a deep inhale in a world built for exhaling. The building was nearly empty, the cleaners already gone. Or so she thought, until she heard the soft clink of metal against tile coming from the maintenance hallway. It was subtle, almost apologetic, and Maya wouldn't have noticed it if she hadn't been so attuned to the sound of things breaking, even quietly. When she followed the sound, she found him crouched beside a vent, his hands steady as he adjusted a faulty seal. He didn't look up at first, just kept working, the quiet competence of his movements both comforting and disarming. He wore a navy jumpsuit with the name D. Carter stitched on the chest. When he did glance up, his gaze met hers without hesitation, but without assumption either. "Didn't mean to disturb," he said, his voice low and even, like someone who had learned long ago not to raise it unless absolutely necessary. "You didn't," she replied, and then added, before she could think twice, "I don't usually have company this late." He offered the hint of a smile, then returned to his work. She could have walked away, should have. But something in the way he moved carefully, with intention, made her linger. "What's your name?" she asked. "Dante," he said. "Dante Carter." She nodded, repeating it softly to herself like a name she'd heard before in a dream. That was the first night. After that, it became a pattern. She stayed late, and he happened to be there. Sometimes fixing lights, sometimes checking the generator in the basement. Once, even tuning the old upright piano in the break room that no one used anymore. One night, she found him sitting at that piano, fingers brushing the keys, hesitant at first, then fluid. She didn't speak, just listened. When he noticed her, he stopped playing. "Don't stop," she said. "It's the first real thing I've heard in this building all week." He smiled then, not the polite kind, but the kind that crept into the corners of his eyes and stayed there. "Music's not my job," he said, "but it's the only thing that doesn't lie to me." She nodded. "I know the feeling." They didn't speak about their personal lives, not at first, but truth has a way of seeping in through the cracks. She learned that he used to be a sound engineer, that he left the industry after something he never quite explained, that his mother had passed recently, that he had once tried to start a community arts center but couldn't get the funding. She told him about Elijah, about how they met at a college fundraiser and how she buried him in a suit she knew he hated because it was the only one the funeral home would press in time. She told him she hadn't cried at the service, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how to make the tears mean something. He listened without interruption. When she was done, he only said, "That's a lot to carry alone." She nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen without being studied. It wasn't love, not then. It was something quieter but heavier, a gravity that pulled at the spaces in between, asking questions they hadn't dared voice aloud. He started leaving small things for her in the break room: a packet of jasmine tea, a note with a quote from Baldwin. Once, a pencil sketch of a tree with roots that curled like question marks. She responded in kind, brought him a book of poems, shared part of her lunch, left the piano open. It was their own language, built slowly, carefully, with pauses and glances and silence that spoke louder than words. And then someone noticed. A photo circulated, grainy, taken through the glass door of the break room. Maya standing beside the piano, Dante seated mid-laugh. It appeared first in a Slack channel she didn't know existed, then in an email from HR requesting a private conversation. When she entered the room, they greeted her with courtesy and concern disguised as professionalism. "We're just looking out for you," they said. "There's been talk. You understand?" She didn't answer at first, just stared at them until the silence made them shift in their seats. "Dante is an employee," she said finally, "and this company doesn't get to police kindness." They reminded her of the board's expectations, of optics and narratives. She reminded them she owned 51% of the company. The meeting ended quickly. She told Dante that night, expecting him to pull away. Instead, he looked at her for a long time and said, "You don't have to fight this for me." She laughed, short and bitter. "I'm not fighting for you. I'm fighting because I'm tired of pretending that dignity has a dress code." He took her hand then, not as a promise, but as an acknowledgement. They both knew what was coming. The whispers would grow louder, the scrutiny would sharpen. But neither of them moved. Weeks passed. They met less often, not because they wanted to, but because the world had found their quiet and decided to flood it. One night, she sent him a message. "Are you free?" He replied with the address of a small studio space in Roxbury, a place he sometimes used to repair instruments for local kids. When she arrived, he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by broken amps and stringless guitars. She joined him without speaking. They sat shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with everything unspoken. Finally, she asked, "Do you think we're making a mistake?" He looked at her, his eyes steady. "I think we're making something real. And real always looks like a mistake to people who only live on paper." They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. Some things are louder than touch. The next morning, she returned to the office and found her keycard deactivated. Security had been reset, they said. She wasn't fired, not officially, but meetings were scheduled without her. Projects were reassigned. The board had begun circling like vultures who sensed blood under a silk blouse. She could fight it, or she could walk away. She chose the latter. 2 weeks later, the studio in Roxbury became their headquarters, not for a company, for something else, something raw and unpolished and necessary. They called it the Williams and Carter Studio. They fixed what was broken: instruments, radios. Once, a battered wheelchair. But more than that, they created space for kids who didn't have one, for elders with stories no one listened to, for art that didn't fit gallery walls. Maya swept the floor at night. Dante painted murals by day. They played piano together when the world got too loud. One evening, a boy named Theo asked, "Are you two in love?" Maya laughed. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You look like music when you stand next to each other." Dante smiled, eyes meeting hers. "Guess that makes us a duet." The world didn't stop spinning. The board filed legal threats. The press came sniffing. But in the small studio with peeling paint and secondhand light, Maya finally felt like she wasn't holding her breath anymore. She had traded power for purpose, suits for soil, expectations for echoes, and in the quiet, she found her voice again. The first time Maya saw the studio covered in sunlight, it looked less like a workspace and more like a dream someone had tried to forget for too long. The windows were old, framed with chipped blue paint, the floorboards creaked when you stepped too fast, and there were faint water stains on the ceiling that no one had bothered to hide. But in the light, it was warm, lived in, real. She walked barefoot that morning, tracing the cracks between each plank like they were lines in a story not yet written. Dante was already up, soldering wires into the back of a broken amp. His hands moved with precision, steady and unfazed, even though they hadn't slept much. The night before had been loud emails from reporters, a voicemail from her father she hadn't played yet, and 3 letters from the board's legal team reminding her that the studio name included Williams, which they claimed was trademarked and intellectually bound to corporate legacy. She didn't care. Not anymore. Her name didn't belong to them. It never had. By noon, the studio had come alive in that soft, rhythmic way it always did. People trickled in, neighbors, kids with busted headphones, elders with stories and tea, and a woman named Miss Laureen who brought a shopping cart full of broken clocks and 2 mason jars of peach preserves. "I heard this was a place where time gets fixed," she said, winking as she handed Dante a jar. Maya laughed, and for a moment, she let herself believe the world was turning toward them instead of away. They had painted a mural on the back wall, a burst of color and movement that looked like jazz made visible. Hands reaching for one another, broken gears blooming into flowers in a single line in bold black letters. "We mend more than what's visible." But the world doesn't stay kind when kindness starts gathering attention. By the end of the week, their studio had made it onto the local news. A segment titled, "Former CEO Rebuilds Broken City, One Repair at a Time." It was meant to be uplifting, a human interest piece squeezed between sports and weather, but it changed everything. The next day, the city council received a formal complaint alleging unauthorized modification of property. It came from a familiar name, Crenshaw Development Group. Maya recognized it instantly. Walter Crenshaw, the investment mogul who had tried to buy out 3 blocks of Roxbury last year under the guise of urban renewal. Her father had once called him a necessary shark. Now, he was circling again. A letter arrived, sealed, official, and cold. It read like a threat dressed as a courtesy. "The property currently operating as Williams & Carter Studio is subject to ownership review and compliance investigation. All operations must cease within 30 days pending inspection." Maya read it twice, then set it on the counter like spoiled fruit. Dante stood behind her, silent. When she turned, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. They'd been found, not just physically, but ideologically. They'd dared to build something hopeful, and now the machinery of power was turning to crush it. They held a meeting that night, right there in the studio. No microphones, just folding chairs and voices. A dozen neighbors came, some angry, some scared, some already resigned to loss. Maya stood on a crate in the middle of the room and spoke. Her voice didn't tremble. They wanted to take this space because it doesn't fit their vision of progress, because it doesn't make them money, because it wasn't theirs to begin with. But this place belongs to us, and if we let it go quietly, they'll take everything else next. No one clapped. It wasn't that kind of speech, but something shifted. A current passed between them, commitment, not loud but deep. The next morning, the mural was vandalized. Thick black paint scrawled across it, the words crude and deliberate. Stick to cleaning. Maya arrived before Dante and just stood there, staring at it, her breath caught, not from fear, from rage. When Dante joined her, he looked at the wall for a long time, then went inside. He returned with paint cans, brushes, and the same quiet resolve that had first drawn her to him. Together, they repainted it. Not to erase the insult, but to absorb it. The words became part of the new mural, woven into the roots of the tree at its center. The letters faded into vines. The insult became soil. Growth followed. That afternoon, a young woman named Jessa came to the studio shaken. She was 17, holding a violin case with broken hinges and a silence heavier than her body. She didn't speak, just handed Maya the case and looked away. Inside, the violin was snapped clean at the neck. Dante examined it carefully. "This can be fixed," he said. Jessa looked at him, tears brimming but not falling. "Can I stay here?" she asked. Maya didn't hesitate. "Yes, you already belong." Jessa came every day after that. She painted quietly in the back room, restoring broken things with delicate hands. Other kids followed. Theo, with the crooked glasses and questions about galaxies. Marcus, who played piano like he was angry at it. Nia, who recited poems to the walls. The studio became more than a place. It became a reason. And that was the problem. Because 2 weeks later, the city inspector arrived. His name was Dean McAllister, but everyone called him Red Tape. He wore a clipboard like armor and walked through the studio like he was already planning its demolition. He cited violations, electrical codes, zoning infractions, unlicensed assembly use, he read aloud, as if the words themselves were criminal. Maya followed him step by step, answering calmly, challenging quietly. But when he reached the back room where Jessa was painting, he paused. "This space isn't zoned for occupancy," he said. Jessa froze. Maya stepped forward. "It's art. She's not sleeping here. She's creating." He wrote something on the clipboard, then left without another word. That night, Maya and Dante sat in the center of the studio, surrounded by open instrument cases and silence. "They're going to shut us down," she said. "They're going to pretend it's about safety, about legality, but really it's about control." Dante looked at her, then picked up a paintbrush and dipped it into gold. He painted a single line across the floor, from one end of the studio to the other. "Then let them see what we built before they bury it." And the next morning, Maya wrote an open letter and posted it online. It read, "They say this place is dangerous. They say it breaks rules. What we break is silence. What we build is belonging. If they shut us down, it will not be because we were wrong. It will be because we dared to be right without permission." It went viral within hours. Journalists reached out. City council members started making phone calls. And then Gloria Stanton, the host of a popular podcast called Unseen Boston, arrived with a mic and curiosity. She interviewed Maya, then Dante, then Jessa. She didn't ask about violations. She asked about vision. And Maya spoke like someone who had finally remembered why she had built anything to begin with. A week later, the podcast aired. 1 million downloads in 24 hours. Hashtags appeared. #FixWhatMatters. #StudioBelongs. Strangers donated money. Others volunteered their time. Someone sent pizza with a note. We see you." But Walter Crenshaw didn't back down. He filed a formal lawsuit claiming trademark infringement and property misappropriation. The papers arrived in a thick envelope, signed with authority and arrogance. Maya read them aloud in the studio. Then she tore them in half. Because by then, the studio wasn't a liability. It was a movement. And movements don't sign cease and desist letters. They write songs. They build walls that speak. They take insults and turn them into murals. They survive. The mural stood taller than ever, no longer just a splash of color on a brick wall, but a monument to resistance. People came from across Boston now, not to get their phones fixed or their radios rewired, but to stand before that wall and see silence. Some touched it, others prayed. A few took photos and posted them with the long captions about community and healing and hope in the face of bureaucracy. Maya watched from the doorway, unsure if she felt proud or terrified. The attention was a double-edged sword. Every person who came through their door was another witness, another voice to their cause, but also another name on a growing list of reasons for the city to shut them down. They were winning something intangible, and that made them dangerous. One morning, before the city was fully awake, Maya received a phone call. The voice on the other end was cold and clipped. "Ms. Williams, we have Dante Carter in custody. He's being held for questioning related to threats made against a city official." Her heart stopped. "That's not possible," she said immediately, but the line had already gone dead. She dropped everything and ran. When she reached the precinct, they wouldn't let her see him. They claimed he had been overheard making a threat against Dean McAllister, the same inspector who had tried to shut them down weeks ago. Maya laughed when she heard it, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Dante didn't threaten people. He fixed broken wiring with hands so gentle they once coaxed a song out of a piano held together by duct tape. He didn't raise his voice unless it was to sing. But absurdity was the language of power, and this arrest wasn't about justice. It was about sending a message. Gloria Stanton showed up within the hour, microphone in one hand, rage in the other. She live-streamed Maya's interview with the police outside the station. "This is intimidation," Maya said, plain and simple. "They're weaponizing fear against people who've only tried to build something better." The video went viral within minutes. Protesters gathered outside. Kids from the studio held up handmade signs. "Let Dante go. Fixing is not a crime. Music, not malice." That night, someone painted the words "Truth can't be detained" across the precinct wall in dripping gold. By morning, it was scrubbed clean, but the internet never forgets. Dante was released 2 days later. No charges, no apology, just a warning. He walked out into the sunlight, looking tired but unbroken. Maya met him with open arms and no words. The hug said everything. He whispered into her ear, "They can't shut down what lives in people." That evening, they held a gathering at the studio. Not a rally, not a press event, just a coming together. People brought folding chairs and food. They passed around stories like currency. An elder named Ruth recited a poem she hadn't shared in 40 years. A boy named Milo played a broken trumpet like it was whole. Maya and Dante sat side by side, watching it unfold, their hands intertwined under the table. But Walter Crenshaw wasn't finished. The very next day, a team of lawyers arrived at the studio with a stack of documents thick enough to crush. Crenshaw Development was filing an injunction to halt all operations. citing a violation of a property clause buried in a decades-old zoning agreement. The documents were dense, legal jargon designed to confuse and overwhelm, but at their core, they said this: "You don't belong here." Maya didn't flinch. She called Raymond Archer. Raymond had been a civil rights attorney in the 70s, retired now, but sharp as ever. He wore corduroy jackets and carried the weight of too many forgotten battles. When Maya laid the papers before him, he studied them in silence, then said, "They're counting on you to be tired, to feel small. But this isn't law. It's intimidation dressed in legalese. And intimidation only works on people who haven't found their people. You have yours." He agreed to represent them pro bono. Word spread fast. By the next week, City Hall was forced to schedule a public hearing. It wasn't just about the studio anymore. It was about precedent, about who got to build and who got bulldozed, about whether beauty, born in quiet corners, deserved to exist at all. The hearing room was packed: reporters, lawyers, residents, skeptics, supporters. Maya stood at the front with Dante, Raymond beside her. Crenshaw's team arrived with polished shoes and binders. They spoke first. Charts, statistics, language so clean it felt sterilized. When they finished, Maya stood. She didn't have charts. She didn't have slides. She had her voice, and she used it. She told them about the kids who came in with broken headphones and left with poems, about the elders who taught songs to children who had never heard their grandparents hum, about the mural that started as protest and became sanctuary. She spoke not like a CEO, but like someone who had built something with her bare hands and wasn't ready to see it torn apart. When she finished, the room was silent. Not because they didn't believe her, but because some truths don't need applause. Then the witnesses came. Miss Lorene, Jessa, Theo, even Marcus, who never talked in public. Each one stepped forward and shared something real. Not data, not doctrine, just truth. When it was over, Raymond stood and said, "If this space goes, we don't just lose a studio, we lose a heartbeat." The council said they would deliberate. They didn't need to, because that night someone vandalized the mural again. But this time it wasn't just paint. They used fire. The flames reached high, angry, and fast. By the time the fire department arrived, part of the studio was gone. The mural, the back room, the piano, ashes. Dante stood in front of the wreckage, his hands clenched. Maya joined him, eyes wide but dry. No one cried. Not yet. There wasn't time. Because by dawn, the community showed up. They brought paint, they brought brushes, they brought hope. And Maya? She brought blueprints. Not to rebuild what was lost, to build what came next. The ash was still warm when the first child knelt and placed a single daisy where the mural used to stand. No one had told her to do it. No one had orchestrated this moment. But by midday, the wall had become a garden of defiance flowers, candles, notes, sketches, a cracked violin, and a spray-painted message across the remaining bricks that read, "We rise in pieces." Maya stood beside the makeshift shrine, her hands raw from lifting charred debris, her eyes dry from exhaustion. But inside her, something had shifted. The grief had become direction. The loss had become blueprints. And she wasn't building for approval anymore. She was building for permanence. Raymond filed an emergency injunction with the court that same day, arguing that the fire was an act of targeted violence against a legally contested space, and that demolition efforts by Crenshaw's development group had incited public risk. The judge, perhaps swayed by public pressure or the fear of headlines, granted a temporary hold on all proceedings. That gave them time. Not much, but enough. Maya and Dante worked through the night, alongside neighbors, artists, architects, and strangers who showed up with gloves and shovels. Someone brought lighting rigs. Another offered scaffolding. Jessa returned with a backpack full of paintbrushes and a notebook of mural sketches she'd been too shy to show before. Theo brought a laptop loaded with 3D renderings of what the studio could become. People didn't ask what they were being paid. They asked what was needed. That was the difference. By the third day, a local news station ran a special segment titled Ashes in Action, the fight to save Boston's most beautiful ruin. Maya didn't watch it. She was too busy drafting grant proposals, filing emergency permits, and organizing a benefit concert with Gloria Stanton, who had turned her podcast into a megaphone for their cause. Dante was rebuilding the piano. Not fixing it, rebuilding it, from the blackened keys up. He said it helped him remember why silence needed music. But Crenshaw wasn't finished. On the morning of the concert, Maya received a letter from the city's Zoning Appeals Board. The permit to rebuild had been denied, inconsistent with district usage, it read. She laughed when she read it, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even herself. That night, as she and Dante sat on the edge of the burned studio steps, she said, "They think if they bury us under paperwork, we'll suffocate before we bloom." He looked at her, fingers stained with paint, and said, "So we break the ground first." They appealed, publicly, loudly. A rally was held outside City Hall. Over 200 people came, some with signs, some with stories. Maya stood on the back of a truck bed with a bullhorn and read aloud every letter of denial the studio had received, then tore each one in half and tossed it into a box labeled fuel. They burned it all that night in a controlled fire, lighting the remains of the old piano on a small pyre. Jessa played a melody on her new violin while the flames danced. It wasn't mourning, it was metamorphosis. 3 days later, the city reversed its decision. They called it a procedural reevaluation, but everyone knew it was surrender. Maya didn't celebrate. She scheduled the groundbreaking. The new studio went up faster than anyone thought possible. Reclaimed wood, solar panels, a mural wall made of rotating panels so every artist could leave their mark. Inside, a performance stage, a repair bench, a library corner, and a quiet room where people could just sit and breathe. They called it the Echo Room, named after a child who once said the studio sounded like people finally being heard. On opening day, a girl approached Maya with a painting of her and Dante, standing hand in hand beneath a golden tree. "It's how I see you," she whispered. Maya knelt, accepted the picture, and said, "It's how I want to be." Her father didn't attend the reopening, but he sent a message through one of his aides. "You've lost control of your name," it read. Maya smiled and deleted it, because the truth was she'd finally taken it back. The city named the studio a community anchor site, granting it protected status and funding. But that wasn't the victory. The real win was the mural that rose from the ashes. It didn't depict Maya or Dante or any singular hero. It showed hands, hundreds of them, reaching, creating, repairing, holding. At the center was a gold thread that wove through them all, binding them into something unbreakable. In the months that followed, Maya and Dante continued their work. Quietly, steadily, no longer under threat, no longer underground. They held hands in public. They argued over wall colors. They laughed too loud during meetings. they lived. One night, as winter whispered at the edges of fall, they stood outside the studio watching the mural glow under newly installed lights. Maya leaned into him and said, "I never wanted to be famous. I just wanted to matter." He kissed the side of her head and replied, "You made space for the world to breathe. That's more than fame. That's legacy." And as the wind swept through the streets of Boston, carrying with it echoes of song, laughter, and the sound of something finally being whole, Maya knew he was right. They hadn't just built a studio. They had built proof that love, when fused with courage, becomes a revolution.